I think the link, and I'm going to pass this over to Lori because I think she could color in these lines pretty darn well. The link between psychological safety, mental health, human performance, and overall ability to change, to drive change, transformational or incremental. But the fast change being enabled by those underpinning, currently quite trendy topics, I think is quite interesting. And Lori, do you see that concept of bringing your whole self to work, safety, psychological safety, candor, some of those concepts, do you see those as being things that have to be in place before you can even start talking about transformational change in an organization? How do you set the table, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I like the how do you set the table, especially right after Thanksgiving. So I don't know. A good example for me is in the world of, let's say we are all students, and I've made plenty of mistakes, right, through my career. And so I also come from a background of let's get things in order, nice and neat, make sure the lines are clear, where are the ditches, and do things very organized in a very sequential path. And I think since you've asked the question, I'm not sure that things have to be done in the order that they used to have to be done in. And I do want to correct myself in that I want to be clear, since you asked the question, I pride the fact that whether it was a young engineer or a senior engineer, that they felt comfortable to bring the concept up. And I also want to make sure it's clear that that all diversity of thought is actually extremely valuable in this world of transformational change and incremental change. So to your point, I do believe creating that mindset that Michael had mentioned, where everybody's view is valued, that we value diversity of thought, right? So, and this isn't visible diversity in any means. This is like all the ideas, diversity of thought, saying, well, we could solve it with digitally printing the tool, or we could take the drawings, scale them back, and bid it out to see how fast we can get this built, right? I mean, it's saying, let's look at all the ideas. And yes, there's going to be a winner and a loser because we can't do them all because we have a time period, we have a constraint. And really making sure that people feel good about themselves. Like Michael said, that they have the safety, the psychological safety to bring it up. And then how do you nurture the direction you headed versus the direction you didn't? And how do you make sure folks know, okay, we're all part of a system. And I then think by recognizing that that was a success and that all the ideas were valued, that is setting the table, right? And so, so my mindset I've had to change. I've had to go back and say, okay, if I look back at my career, how could I have done things differently? And yeah, there have been a lot of things that we did that I've done where I've said, we have to have this in place before we can do this, before we can do this, before we can do this. And the reality is, no. If we need to solve these problems, this rate of change of problems that are getting more and more complex, by the way, with strong systems thinking, to solve them at the pace of change that they need to be solved, we can't do things in a sequential order anymore. Things may have to happen simultaneously. And so now what behaviors are needed to encourage that thought, that action, and how do we create a system around that? And for me, that is, I think, the core of the change. I do want to bring up one thing that you had both mentioned, and it probably goes back to even to turnaround thinking. But if there's more focus on causal learning and what was the core cause of that breakdown or the core systemic cause of X problem, and then a lot of energy around how can we innovate versus incrementally change that solution, that's probably for me one of the core skills that I think is needed moving forward. And causal learning, causal reasoning, and then really focusing in on the core cause or contributing factors versus just solving the problem, which may just be a symptom. I think that's also going to be critical moving forward. I hope that helped.
Lori, I'm completely on board. And Teresa, if I can take a moment just to respond to that, because it's reminding me of the time I spent up at MIT looking at the Macondo disaster, Deepwater Horizon, otherwise named. And there was a number of people around the table that were looking for the main cause. And that was the problem. That was the mindset shift that not just myself, but a number of people around the table at the time say, whoa, let's stop our process, because if we're only looking for main causes, we're going to actually miss the solution, because the solution isn't in the main factor. So the issues are across many factors. And you've seen, very likely the report that was generated after years of study that arrived at what's called the Swiss cheese model, where all the holes had to line up to be able to create the conditions that caused that major disaster. And one of the things that was very, very clear is that the individuals who would have pushed for some type of very simple regression equation on the main variables would have missed 70% of that model that needs to be understood to be able to absolutely prevent disasters like that from happening. So that was one of the things that happened in my early experience in those days of recognizing that if we allow, and some of the people that were aiming towards main cause were very senior individuals who had a considerably more experience in that context than I did. And at the same time, they were thinking about efficiency and cost effectiveness of solution, et cetera, which absolutely are important to consider. And if you only think in those terms, you're going to absolutely miss solving the ultimate problem that is multiple causes.
Real quick, just to add to that, for me, because I think causal learning, since I mentioned it, might mean different things to different people. But for me, it's about what had to be true to cause this to happen. And to your point, Michael, this thing that we could all see and observe could have had multiple causes. And then figuring out of all those potential causes, what had to be true to cause those to happen. And then peeling the onion all the way back so that we now have a system of things that we need to consider to change to prevent the stack of causes to happen. And so that was for me the causal thinking. I like how you described it. I don't know anything about that incident in any detail, but other than what we learned through our own training. But for me, if we're thinking through causal reasoning and causal learning and doing it from, like you said, from the motive, with the deep, deep motive of doing nothing more but just to learn, I think we end up in a different spot. And I think that's a lot about, Teresa, your example. It's changing the end in mind, which is to learn, versus to find the problem, right? It's really, for me, it changes the whole dynamic. And I've had to learn a lot. I've been, fortunate to learn from some experts in the industry, and I still have a lot more to learn. But I do think that helps with the transformational and the incremental change, because then we're solving hopefully the right problems.